Hello, and welcome back to yet another exploration of the classical Japanese that occurs in Genshin Impact. Today we are moving on from Ayaka and onto a new character, one of my favorites, one who's in my usual party almost all the time and is super good. That character being...
まったく地境が湧かぬ上に邪魔までされるとは
Yes, it's the Wandering Samurai, the Herald of the Red Maple Leaves, and my favorite moniker, Genshin Best Boy. It's Kaidehara Kazuha. Yes. Kazuha actually has tons and tons of classical Japanese poetic references. And jumping right into it, perhaps the most notable reference about him is his name. Because the way you write his name, his last name, his family name technically, Kaedehara. Kaede means a maple tree. It's the kind of tree from which red maple leaves fall. And hara means something like field. You see it a lot in names. So names like Fujiwara, which the wara comes from the hara, means field of wisteria flowers. Or you can think of something like Matsuhara maybe is a way that you could say it as. Matsu is a pine tree, a kind of pine tree, and so Matsuhara is like a field of pine trees. So Kazuha's family name is Kaedehara, means a field of maple trees, which is already beautiful. But where the real magic happens is with his first name, his given name, Kazuha. Because the way you write his name is with these two kanji, which I'll put up here on the screen. The first one is this one. Now, when you know Japanese, if you know regular Japanese, the way you would normally read this kanji is man, and it means 10,000. However, the more significant meaning behind it is, although it does mean 10,000, it can also mean like a lot, a ton of whatever, a myriad of things, innumerable things. And that's the aspect I want to focus on today. Innumerable. It is a number, okay? Because the word kazu literally means number. So this character here means 10,000, innumerable, and is a number. Therefore, one of the ways that we read it is kazu. Actually, that's not one of the ways we normally read it, but one thing you have to know about Japanese is that all of the rules you think you know, all of the kanji you think you know, when it comes to names, all of those rules get thrown out the window. Names are kind of ridiculous. Anyway, so this is how we read it, kazu. It means 10,000, innumerable, and is a number, therefore we call it kazu, which means number. Now the second part of his name, ha, that is how we read this kanji in modern regular Japanese as well. And it means leaf, a leaf, like a falling maple leaf, which is cool. But the interesting thing is that when you look at how the ancient Japanese talked about words, speaking, literature, and whatnot, for some reason there's this really intimate connection with plant material. For whatever reason, like for example, the word koto or koto no ha, koto meaning like a thing or to speak, a word, and then ha meaning leaf. So word leaf means a word, essentially. Another instance of this you can see in the way they use the term kusa, which means grass. So for example, the work tsurezure gusa means boredom, tsurezure means boredom, and then kusa means grass, so boredom grass. Or the way we translate it in English is essays in idleness. And basically, kusa kind of just means writings in general. So we have boredom grass, which means writings of boredom, the things that I wrote when I was bored. Or we have, for example, Sei Shonagon's famous makura no soshi. Makura meaning pillow, so being another way of reading this kanji for grass, and shi meaning child, so the grass child of my pillow, which basically, Sei Shonagon wrote this, she kept some paper by her pillow, and before she went to bed, she just wrote down random jots and tittles and whatever she felt like writing about, and that became Makura no Soshi. So again, we see this weird connection between plant matter and literature, speaking, language, those kinds of things. And so with Kazuha, one of the things that you can look at it is he has innumerable leaves or innumerable words. And actually, where the magic really happens is this is the exact same way that you write one of the most significant and important works of classical Japanese poetry, one of the seminal collections of all of Japanese poetry. That is the Manyoshu. Another way, like I said, you can read this kanji is man, and another way you can read ha is yo. So the Manyoshu, which is the oldest extant collection of Japanese poetry in history. It's the oldest one that we have. It was compiled sometime in the Nara period, I believe, and it features some really, really old poems. A lot of people consider it to be one of the purest forms of Japanese culture because it was written, and a lot of the poems were written along, well, at least people say, before there was a huge influx of Chinese culture. And so it's closer to the original Japanese spirit, is how some people argue it. Now, it's probably not the most important collection of Japanese poetry. That one probably goes to the Kokin Wakashu, but it is up there. It is probably number 2, number 3, something around there. And so Kazuha's name directly references this collection of Japanese poems, some of the most Japanese of the Japanese poems. Again, that is a little bit arguable. But also, most of the references that Kazuha makes are from the Manyoshu, which we will get into. We will go over one of those here. But there is at least one other thing I want to go over first before we get there. And that is this poem that Kazuha himself supposedly writes here.
Kumo takaki higure no sora ni.
At least these are the first 2 lines of a haiku, and that haiku ends at the end of the trailer, which goes,
続きは心もゆ.
And now I have taken the liberty of actually writing up this little poem, this little haiku myself, just so we can go over it and I can highlight things and whatnot, and you can follow along a little more easily. So, this haiku that Kazuha himself writes in his little trailer starts with the word kumo. This word right here, kumo, which means cloud. Simple enough. Then we have takaki. Now, this comes from the root word takashi, which is an adjective. So, it describes it's like soft or hard or fast, slow. But this means high or tall. Now, normally, the infinitive, I guess you could say, the regular version of this, and technically what is the ending version, is takashi. And you would use takashi if you were talking about, like, you had a sentence and you were just saying that, oh, look, that thing up there is really high, is sono kumo ga takashi, right? That cloud is really high up. But that's the ending of the sentence. That's the ending form. It means the sentence is over, we're done, we're not moving on. However, it is conjugated in the attributive form. Now, what's the attributive form? It's a form that you use with both adjectives and verbs, as we will see, where you use it to describe a thing that follows immediately. So, for example, you can say, kumo ga takashi, the cloud is high. Or you can say, takaki kumo, which means a high cloud. So this one is kumo takaki. And what this means is it is saying the high cloud, and then it's describing a thing that comes next. And that thing that comes next is higure. Now, this is a combination of 2 words. Hi means sun. It's just a noun, the sun. And then we have the verb. However, the verb is conjugated in a way that it turns it into a noun, which, I'm sorry, there's a lot of jargon, but bear with me. It turns it into a noun. So the root verb is, I think, kuru, or in modern Japanese, kureru, which means to come to a close, to end. Now, when you use it in regards like this, when you make it into a noun, a lot of times what it denotes is the sunset. So one of the ways that we say in modern times is yugure, or they use that in other classical Japanese poems as yugure. However, they want to focus on the sun, and in order to meet syllable count so that there's not too many syllables, instead of saying yugure, which is what I would expect, they say higure. Now, so that means sun and sunset. So the sunset. So the high cloud sunset. And then we have this possessive or attributive no, I guess you could say. Basically, the easiest way to translate this is of. Now, in Japanese, although they use the word of and no can be translated as of, we do have to be aware of the order. So, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is, even though I'm not big into pop music, The Shape of You, right? I don't remember I don't know the singer, but there's The Shape of You. Now, if you were to translate that into Japanese, both classical and modern Japanese, but the rule stays the same. But in modern Japanese, you would say, instead of the shape of you, you would say you of the shape. Anata no katachi. You of shape. Anata no katachi. So if you notice, you have to switch the two sides of the of in Japanese for it to make sense. So, higure no. So, of the sunset. Of the sunset with the high clouds, okay? And then we have the word sora, which is just a noun that means the sky. So, the sky of sunset, high clouds. So, the high clouds, sunset of sky. Sorry. And then we have ni, which is a particle that denotes place, position, sometimes direction. The best way you can translate it as some kind of a preposition. So at, on, in, or to, toward, something like that. So in this case, I think in would be the best way to describe it. So in the sky of the sunset with the high clouds. Okay. And then the final line is kokoro moyu. Now, if you guys are like me, and maybe even if you don't necessarily know Japanese, you don't speak Japanese, and you watch a lot of anime, you probably know what kokoro is. Kokoro means heart. However, I want to point out, kokoro does not refer to the actual physical organ in any sense. What it refers to is that inner thing, that inner experiencer of emotions, of thought. It's that thing from which thoughts and ideas and feelings and emotions spring from. So kokoro means me, my heart, my essence, my being, kind of a thing. And then moyu. In modern Japanese, we would say moeru, but in classical Japanese, it's moyu. And what this word means, it's a verb that means to burn. And it is in the ending form. So this means that the sentence is over. We're done, okay? And so basically, my heart burns. Now, heartburn, again, because this doesn't have anything to do with the physical heart, it's not that acid reflux. Kazuha isn't complaining about acid reflux. Simply what he's saying is, in the high clouded sunset sky, my heart burns. And you can imagine that this is kind of a burning of passion. He's doing what Kazuha does best in that he's hanging out, he's watching the natural scenery, and he is suddenly moved by passion to write poetry, to comment on the scenery, to come up with some kind of a refrain, to express this burning, this probably this warm, and I don't think it's a ferocious, like, oh, let's go kind of a burning. It's this warm, subtle, comforting burning. But regardless, his heart burns. And while that reference is really cool because that is technically in-game, or in-trailer rather, that is a poem that Kazuha himself is trying to come up with, and he comes up with the first two lines, and he's sitting there thinking like, what should the last line be? And he goes through all of these things and remember these things, and then he decides that, hey, I'm going to end it with this. But while that is cool, I'm actually a little more interested in the references to classical literature that Kazuha does. There's a ton of them. There's several of them, in fact. So let's go over one of the lines that he says when he does his burst, which is, so in case you didn't hear it very well, that is Kumo gakure karinaku toki. Now, that is very clearly a direct reference to one of the poems from the Manyoshu, which again is a collection of poetry that he gets his namesake from. Now, the original poem here is slightly different because what Kazuha says is Kumo gakure, which is more of a modern thing. It's gakure. But in the original poem, it actually says Kumo gakuri. Now, that's just because there's a little bit of change between times. I mean, languages evolve, and this was written, this was written either in the 600s or 700s, so this was over 1500. This was what? This was 1,300 years ago. So this was over a millennia ago. So it's no surprise that there is at least a little bit of change. But to analyze this poem, which I've got right up here for you, we have kumo, which is, as we just saw, cloud. And then we have gakuri, which comes from the root verb kakuru in classical Japanese, kakureru in modern Japanese, which means to hide. And then we have it conjugated in this form, which can be one of two things. It can either turn it into a noun, or it can make it into a connective thing. So it's like we're saying this, but we're not done with the idea in the sentence, and it's connecting to the next part of the sentence. So kumo gakuri, which means hidden in the clouds or hiding in the clouds, cloud hiding. Cloud hiding, kari naku toki wa is the next line. Kari means geese or goose, silly goose. But the kari are naku. Okay, the kari cry is what naku means. And it's not the cry necessarily like, even though it kind of can be that. It's more like an exclamation. When you talk about animals, and particularly very sonorous and vocal animals, so like geese or birds or insects, they naku, they cry out with a voice. So the geese cry, and then we have this word toki. Now toki is technically a noun, and it means a time or an instance. It's time in the sense of like at a specific point in time. Now, the way toki works, if we were to translate this into English, karinaku toki, basically what that means is when the geese cry, because that's one of the ways you can use toki, or that's how you would use toki in Japanese a lot. Like in modern Japanese, if you say something like I eat, you say taberu toki, when I eat, or anata ga iku toki, when you go. So this karinaku toki means when the geese cry. And then we have this particle wa, which this one's going to be a bit difficult to explain because we don't have an equivalent in English. This most often functions as a subject marker. So when you see this in a sentence, everything that comes before this, or rather the part of it that comes before this, is what the whole sentence kind of revolves around. It kind of singles out and focuses your attention on this thing. So, karinaku toki wa. So, we are talking about when the geese cry hidden in the clouds. That's what we're talking about. And that's the best explanation you're going to get out of me. And then we have akiyama no. And akiyama is pretty easy. It's just a combination of two words. Aki, meaning autumn, and yama, meaning mountain. And I don't know if this is a reference to a specific place name because that does happen a lot in classical Japanese, or it's just referring to the idea of like, it's a mountain covered in autumn foliage and it's autumn time and it's just a random mountain. I'm not sure. But then we have, after akiyama, after autumn mountain, we have the no, which again means of. However, if you translate it in English, you do have to reverse the order. And then the no, so what is of the autumn mountains? It is the momiji, which is written with the two characters for yellow and leaf. What do you know? Leaves show up again. So you can imagine a yellow leaf is referencing to falling autumn foliage, the really beautiful yellow leaves of autumn. Now there is another way to write momiji, which is with the kanji for crimson and leaf, because it kind of is just a catch-all term for autumn foliage. But for this instance, they specifically went with yellow and leaf because I guess they wanted to reference yellow leaves for whatever reason. So the yellow leaves of autumn mountain, of an autumn mountain. And then we have katamatsu. And this one is a little bit difficult to explain. So kata. This word kata means single. Single or one of a pair or one of a set. It's one-sided, once. And the way I think it's best to think about it in this context is singularly. For example, in classical Japanese, you can think of kata toki, which again, toki is the time. So kata toki is single time, which means like for a bit, in a while, or shortly. So kata matsu, in this instance, I believe means earnestly, singularly waiting, because that's what matsu means. Matsu means to wait. And it is in the ending form in this instance. It means, boom, we're done waiting. This is the end of the sentence. So the entire first sentence or first clause of this poem is hidden in the clouds when the geese cry, I earnestly await the autumn foliage of Autumn Mountain. I earnestly await the yellow leaves of Autumn Mountain. And then boom, the sentence is over. However, the poem is not over because then it does a heel turn out of nowhere. Because again, we have toki. Once again, if you notice toki, 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 toki is everywhere. Time. So toki, time, wa, which again is that same wa, means that this is what we're focusing on. Now, if you notice, there is a bit of a repeat. Toki wa, means that whoever this is, whoever wrote this, which we'll get into, he's focusing specifically on times, periods of time, instances in time. So toki wa suguredo. Now, this suguredo comes from the root verb sugu in classical Japanese, in modern Japanese, sugiru. And we have it conjugated in such a way that we can add this edo, this suguredo. Instead of suguru, it's suguredo. And what this conjugation means is even though or despite, in spite of. It denotes something contrary to expectations or reality. So even though, however, despite. And then the root verb sugu, because I totally forgot, sugu or sugiru means to pass by. So even though something passes, even though it passes. And what is doing the passing? The toki, the time. So, to go back and translate this whole thing, kumo ga kuri kari naku toki wa akiyama no momiji katamatsu toki wa suguredo, which means, hidden in the clouds, when the geese cry, I eagerly await the falling of the autumn foliage of an autumn mountain, despite the time having passed, is a way you can say this. So essentially what's going on is the author of this poem, Kakinomoto no Hitomaro, who is one of the most important poets in Japanese history, who I believe actually ended up contributing the highest number, the most poems to this collection, to the Manyoshu of any other poet. He's a very important poet. He was a personal poet, I believe, to the Empress Jito. I'm not entirely sure, don't quote me on that. But regardless, he's a very important poet of the ancient times of the Nara and I believe the Asuka period, which is the time previous, just before the Nara period. So essentially what he's saying is he's out in the autumn mountains and he's eagerly awaiting the autumn leaves. He is eagerly hoping to see the autumn leaves, and he hears behind the clouds the cry of the geese, and the geese are a very notable symbol of autumn time because during autumn the geese fly. They migrate. The geese migrate to wherever it is they're going to go, and as they fly through the sky, they cry. And you can imagine that how stirring it is to see them behind the clouds, or rather not see them, because you see the clouds and they're hidden behind the clouds and they cry, and you can still hear their cries, signaling autumn, which is this time when everything is coming to an end, everything is dying, but it's doing so beautifully and elegantly, and it's just stirring emotions everywhere. So you can imagine him sitting there, and he's in these mountains, and he's seeing all these things. All these things are reminding him of the beauty of autumn, and he's out there to enjoy it. And that's what this poem seems to be setting up. It's like, it's just a celebration of all things autumn and how beautiful it is and how sternly moving despite the inherent sad nature of it because everything, again, is dying, preparing for winter. But then it does a heel turn right at the last line. Toki wa suguredo, despite the time for all of this having passed. So you can imagine this guy is, again, out in the mountains, wanting so badly to enjoy the autumn scenery. But it's too late. He is now too late. He is basically just wandering through mountains where all the leaves have fallen, and the last of the geese are now passing over, and he is wasting his time. He's wandering aimlessly, completely lost. There is no beauty there. And because of that little heel turn, it makes it extremely, extremely sad, I guess. It's extremely melancholic. It's like, what is this symbolizing? He's wandering in his life. He's frustrated. He's got some other things that he doesn't know how to deal with. And what I love about it is it relates back to Kazuha. Because, as you know, one of Kazuha's most notable motifs is the falling maple leaves. He's very obviously related to autumn foliage and winds and leaves on the wind. And he is also a wanderer in the game. Like, he wanders around. He doesn't sit in one place for very long. He constantly is on the move, kind of like the wind. And so you can imagine that Kazuha relates to this because he too also wanders. I don't know if necessarily Kazuha is depressed or anything like the writer of this poem seems to have been, like Kakinomoto no Hitomaro seemed to have been at this time. Kazuha seems to be at peace with most things. Or maybe he is considering his friend because Kazuha does have reason to be sad, having lost one of his friends to Raiden Shogun. And one more thing of note that I've already mentioned, but I'll mention it again, is that this does come from the Manyoshu, with which Kazuha shares a namesake. You write it the same way. And for you people who think you're really, really good at Japanese, you can go ahead and try to read it here. Good luck. But there you go. There's a challenge for you guys who consider yourselves really advanced Japanese speakers or readers or whatever. And this is something you find in classical Japanese poetry, not just poetry, but literature in general, is they seem to celebrate the idea of melancholy. Like, one of the most important words in understanding classical Japanese aesthetics and literary themes is the word aware. And that word means something like sad, melancholic, pathetic in the sense that it's pathos, it's feeling, it's deep sadness, not quite grief. It's not quite like oh no, this is terrible and the horrible thing is happening to me. It's not like, although it kind of is though, because it just means like really, really poignant emotion. And generally, when they use it in classical Japanese, it does mean something like sad, like somebody that you should feel pity for. Pitiable, that's another word for it. Pitiable is like, oh wow, man, that really sucks. However, because those kinds of feelings are some of the most poignant that you can feel as a human being, aware just kind of means something like extremely deeply emotional. So when you're talking about other people or some bad things that happen to them, if in classical Japanese, if you said aware nari, you would say something that means something like, oh man, that sucks, that's too bad. But if you're referencing poetry and you say somebody's poetry is aware nari, that means that it's deeply feeling, it's deeply moving and stirring. So aware can mean something like, oh, that sucks, or oh, that's great, depending on the context. Welcome to Japanese. And you definitely see that here in this poem, which sets up this beautiful scenery, and then on a heel turn completely changes it, and now we're back in sad world and world of aware. This is a very aware naru uta, a very stirring, emotionally resonant, melancholic poem. And that's it. Now we are done here, and I did go over multiple things about Kazuha, but there are still more poems to get through, more poetic references, trust me. But that's going to be it for now. This video is already plenty long. But if you did enjoy the video and you learned something from it, please don't forget to give it a like. If you want to stay informed as to when more videos regarding Kazuha come out, or as to when more videos breaking down classical Japanese and other video games, for example, I plan on doing Okami, I plan on doing Guilty Gear, there's a little bit in Street Fighter there, there's some other games here and there that I do plan on getting into. If you want to be here for those and you want to be notified for when those come out, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And also what I do is I translate 1,000-year-old Heian period Japanese stories into English for your entertainment, your amusement, your education, and possibly maybe even inspiration for those of you who are creatives and like to write stories and could use a little bit of inspiration. So please feel free to check those out. But that's going to do it here. I've said my bit, and hopefully we will see you next time for more breakdowns of the poetic references that Kazuha from Genshin references. Thank you so much. We'll see you later. Have a good one.